In 1988, a small town was shaken by the sudden disappearance of an entire class of middle school students. The children, along with their teacher and a few chaperones, had gone on a field trip to a nearby forest for a day of hiking. The group set out early in the morning, full of excitement and laughter, not knowing that this would be the last time anyone saw them. The class had been well behaved, and there was nothing unusual about the trip. They were supposed to be back by 4 p.m., but as the hours passed and the sun began to set, their families and the school grew worried. A search party was formed by local authorities, and soon after, the media arrived. The town was gripped by fear and uncertainty. The search for the missing students went on for weeks, but it seemed like they had vanished without a trace. The area was calmed by search dogs, helicopters, and volunteers. The forest was vast, but no sign of the class was ever found. The teachers, too, were missing. The whole group had disappeared like they had never existed. Not a single footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. It was as if they had been swallowed up by the earth itself. The townspeople were in shock. How could an entire group just disappear? The police investigated, but with no clues to follow, the case soon went cold. The families of the missing students were left with nothing but empty hopes and unanswered questions. Months passed, and the investigation stalled. The forest was reopened to the public, though many people still avoided it, feeling an uneasy chill whenever they thought of the strange event. Some even whispered about strange occurrences in the woods, a shadow in the trees, strange noises on the wind. But there was no evidence, just rumors that faded into the quiet whispers of the town. For the families, time seemed to stand still. They never gave up hope that their children would come home. Sarah, the mother of one of the students, spent countless nights staring at the woods from her window. She refused to believe that her daughter was gone forever. Each year, she held a small memorial in the town square, keeping her daughter's memory alive. Many people came, but as the years went by, fewer and fewer were willing to talk about the tragedy. It was too painful, too strange. Officer David Walker, who had been one of the first to respond to the disappearance, could never forget that day. Though he had moved on to other cases, the mystery of the missing class haunted him. He had worked tirelessly on the investigation, but like everyone else, he had nothing to show for it. No answers, no closure. He often wondered what had happened to the children. Had they run away? Were they lost in the wilderness? Or was something darker at play? As the years went on, the case was officially closed, but the memories never truly faded. People would still talk about the lost class, and some would say they had seen things, heard things, in the forest. But mostly, it was just a part of the town's forgotten past. And then, in 2008, a shocking event would reopen the case and change everything. 20 years had passed since the class vanished into thin air. Life in the small town had slowly returned to normal, though the mystery still lingered in the background. The memories of that strange day in 1988 haunted the families and everyone who had lived through it. Some had moved away, trying to escape the pain, while others stayed, unable to forget what had happened. Sarah, the mother of one of the missing children, had never been able to let go. She spent her years searching for answers, looking through old police reports and talking to anyone who might know something. No one ever came forward with any new information. The forest, once a place of joy for the children, was now a place avoided by many. Sarah would occasionally go there, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain where her daughter had gone. But all she ever found were old trees and quiet paths, leading nowhere. Life continued, but in the back of everyone's mind, the mystery of the missing class was never truly forgotten. Then, one quiet afternoon in 2008, the impossible happened. Sarah's phone rang, and she was told something that left her speechless. A group of people had been found, people she recognized. The children, now adults, had been spotted walking out of the same forest where they had disappeared. But they weren't just lost, they were back. How had they returned? Where had they been? And why hadn't they aged a single day? The news spread quickly, and soon, the town was buzzing with questions. The missing class, after so many years, had been found. Sarah could barely believe it. She rushed to the meeting place, her heart racing, her mind filled with 1,000 questions. What had happened to them? Why had they disappeared? And why did they look exactly as they had 2 decades ago? When Sarah finally saw her daughter, Emily, standing among the other students, she couldn't help but cry. Emily looked the same smile, same eyes, same everything. But there was something different about her. She seemed distant, almost like a stranger. Her eyes, though unchanged, seemed clouded with confusion. And the rest of the students, though happy to see their families, were all strangely quiet, as if they were struggling to remember something. The adults who had gone with them on the trip were also found, but they too were acting strangely. They were physically unharmed, but their faces told a different story. Their expressions were hollow, as if the memories of the past 2 decades had been erased from their minds. The police quickly took the students and the teachers into protective custody. Doctors and therapists were called in to help them, but no one could explain what had happened to them. They couldn't remember the years they had been missing, and whenever someone tried to ask them what had happened in the forest, they would look at each other with confusion. It was as if the time they had spent gone was a blank page in their lives, never to be written. Sarah stood there, holding Emily's hand, trying to hold back the tears. She had waited so long for this moment, but now that it had come, it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a beginning to something darker, something they all could not yet understand. What happened to them? Where had they been? And why didn't they seem to remember anything? The discovery of the missing class had shaken the town to its core. People couldn't stop talking about it. The news reporters were everywhere, trying to get a glimpse of the returned students and ask them questions. But no one, not even the doctors and therapists, could get clear answers from them. The class members were alive and unharmed, yet they didn't remember anything about where they had been for the past 2 decades. It was as if those years had never happened at all. The adults and children were all taken to a local hospital where doctors tried to help them. Some of the students, including Emily, showed signs of being physically healthy, but their minds were another story. They were confused, disoriented, and often seemed to lose focus, staring into space. When Sarah spoke with Emily, she was happy to see her daughter's face, but something was off. Emily wasn't acting like the young girl she had known all those years ago. Emily was quiet, almost too quiet, and whenever Sarah asked her what had happened during those missing years, Emily simply shook her head. "I don't remember, Mom," she said softly, looking at her with blank eyes. "I don't know what happened." Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't just the lost time. It was the way her daughter looked at her. It was like she was seeing a stranger. Emily's smile had faded, replaced by an emptiness that worried Sarah deeply. There was no joy in her eyes, only confusion. Days passed, and still no answers came. A special team of investigators was brought in to try and understand what had happened to the class, but all their interviews and efforts led to dead ends. The students couldn't recall anything from the time they had been gone. The only thing they all remembered was the day they went on the field trip, followed by the sudden moment when they found themselves walking out of the forest, together but completely unaware of how much time had passed. A few of the students began to show signs of distress. One of them, Mark, began having strange outbursts, speaking about things that no one understood. He said he had seen things in the forest, things that didn't belong in the real world. He spoke of shadows that followed them, of voices in the wind, and of a strange, powerful force that seemed to trap them. "I'm not crazy," Mark said one day, his eyes wild with fear. "We were trapped somewhere. Not here, not in our world." Everyone thought Mark might be imagining things, but there was something in his voice that made them listen. It wasn't just fear, it was genuine terror. Other students started to confirm parts of his story, speaking of strange, twisted versions of the forest. Some of them even mentioned seeing figures, People who weren't supposed to be there, people who didn't belong in the world they knew. Soon, the investigators realized they had a far bigger mystery on their hands than they had expected. The students weren't just confused, they were frightened. The more they tried to recall their memories, the more agitated they became. It was clear they were all holding something back, something they couldn't explain, but something that had left them terrified. Sarah's worry deepened. Her daughter's distant behavior was only getting worse. Emily had started to refuse to talk about the past and instead would spend hours staring out of windows, lost in thought, as if trying to remember something important. But no one could figure out what it was. The town was still reeling from the shock. Some people began to question if the students' return was a blessing or a curse. What had happened to them? Where had they really been? And why were they so afraid to speak about it? It was becoming clear that the answers to these questions might be darker than anyone was prepared for. As the days passed, the situation with the missing class became even stranger. The students were still unable to remember anything from the time they had disappeared, but some of them began to speak in more detail about what they had seen. Mark, the student who had first spoken of strange shadows and voices in the forest, became more insistent that something had happened to them in another place, another world. "I'm telling you," Mark said during one of the group therapy sessions, his voice shaking with emotion. "We weren't in the forest anymore. We were somewhere else." Somewhere wrong. The other students, who had initially been silent or confused, slowly began to nod. Rachel, one of the girls in the class, spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. I remember hearing whispers, like people were calling us. But when we looked, no one was there." Another student, Paul, who had been very quiet since their return, added, I remember seeing the trees twist. They were moving, like they were alive. But they weren't. It was like the whole place was pretending to be something it wasn't. The room went silent. Everyone was listening, but no one fully understood what they were saying. The idea of being in another world seemed impossible, yet the students all seemed to agree on one thing. Something had happened to them that they could not explain. They weren't just lost in the forest. They had been taken somewhere else. Dr. Miller, the psychologist assigned to help the students, took careful notes but was clearly confused by their stories. "What you're describing," he said, looking over his glasses at the group, "sounds like some kind of collective hallucination. It's possible that the stress of the disappearance and the long period of isolation caused your minds to create these images." But even as Dr. Miller said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. The students' stories were too consistent, too similar. It was clear that whatever they had experienced, it was real to them. Liam, one of the town's investigators, had been listening closely to the sessions. He had worked on many strange cases before, but this one was different. There was something unsettling about the way the students spoke. They weren't just recalling memories. They were describing something that had changed them. They weren't acting like the same children who had gone missing all those years ago. After the therapy session, Liam decided to speak to Sarah. She was standing outside, looking at the hospital where Emily and the others were being kept. The worry in her eyes hadn't disappeared, but she was doing her best to stay strong for her daughter. "I don't know what's happening to them, Liam," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're not the same. Emily, she's different. She's afraid, but she won't say why. She says she doesn't remember. But I know she's hiding something." Liam nodded. He understood Sarah's pain. He had seen it before, when someone you loved went through something so traumatic that it changed them forever. He didn't know what the students had experienced, but he knew it wasn't something simple. Whatever had happened in the forest, it had left them with deep scars, ones they couldn't explain. "We need to figure out what really happened," Liam said, his voice firm. "We can't just let this go. There's more to this story, and I think we're just scratching the surface." Sarah looked at him, her face filled with determination. "Then we need to find the answers. For Emily, for all of them." But as they stood there, Neither of them realized how much darker the truth was about to become. The more they uncovered, the more they would discover that some mysteries should never be solved. As the investigation into the mysterious disappearance continued, the students' memories began to resurface. The more they spoke, the more frightening their stories became. It wasn't just the strange forest or the shifting trees. They began describing things they couldn't explain. They spoke of an unnatural darkness that surrounded them, of a feeling like they were not in the same world anymore. Emily, Sarah's daughter, was one of the first to remember something that made everyone uneasy. One evening, after a long day of therapy, she came to Sarah with a troubled look on her face. "Mom," Emily began, her voice trembling. "There was something else. Something I couldn't understand at first. There was a figure. Someone who was watching us." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, a figure?" Emily hesitated, clearly struggling to put her thoughts into words. "It wasn't human. It was tall, shadowy, and it didn't belong. It just stood there, staring at us, but when we tried to look at it closely, it would disappear into the darkness. We couldn't ever escape it." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was the first time Emily had spoken about anything so specific, and the fear in her voice made it hard to ignore. She asked Emily more questions, but Emily couldn't recall much else. The memory was blurry, like a dream that faded when you woke up. Over the next few days, more students began to talk about similar experiences. Mark, the student who had first spoken of the shadows in the forest, grew more agitated as his memories came back. "I remember the cold," he said, his hand shaking. "It wasn't like the cold we know. It was freezing, but it wasn't from the weather. It came from the air itself. And the figure, it was always there. It wasn't just watching. It was following us." The other students listened in silence, their faces pale. They, too, remembered the figure and the cold. One by one, they spoke of a strange presence, something that felt wrong. It was as if they had been trapped in another place, one where the rules of time and space didn't make sense. Liam, the investigator, was growing increasingly concerned. He knew that the students were not lying, but the more they described, the more confused and terrified he became. He had heard of strange phenomena before, but this seemed to be something far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. There was something deeply unsettling about their stories, something that felt impossible. One evening, Liam decided to visit the forest himself. He stood at the edge of the same woods where the class had disappeared all those years ago. The trees were silent in the dark, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The air was cool, but it didn't feel the same as it did on a normal night. There was a weight to it, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Liam stepped carefully into the woods, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He had no reason to think he would find anything, but the strange stories kept nagging at him. He walked for what felt like hours, but the deeper he went, the more uneasy he became. It was as if the forest was shifting, changing. The path that should have led him in a straight line seemed to twist and turn unexpectedly. Suddenly, he heard something, soft footsteps behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. His heart raced, but he forced himself to keep walking, determined to find something, anything, that would explain the mysteries of the past. He didn't know it yet, but his visit to the forest would soon reveal something that would change everything. Liam had spent hours walking through the forest, his flashlight struggling to cut through the thick shadows. The further he ventured, the more unsettling everything felt. The trees seemed to loom over him, twisting in strange angles that made him feel as though they were watching him. His steps seemed to echo louder in the silence, and the air was thick with an odd chill. He stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's just the stories getting to me," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed that. The forest felt alive in a way that was hard to explain. He was used to the woods, but something here was different. As he continued down the path, he felt it again, the same presence the students had spoken about. It was as if something was moving in the distance, something just out of sight. His pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He moved forward cautiously, his flashlight scanning the area. He suddenly heard a low crack, like a branch breaking. He spun around, but again, there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, except for the wind rustling through the leaves. "This is ridiculous," Liam whispered to himself. "I'm just letting the stories get to me. There's nothing here." But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The way the forest felt, the way the air seemed to thicken, it wasn't normal. He decided to head back, but as he turned around, something caught his eye. A faint glow between the trees, just ahead. Liam hesitated. He hadn't seen anything like it before. Curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped carefully toward the light, which flickered in the distance, moving like a will-o'-the-wisp. It wasn't like the usual light from his flashlight. It had a strange, otherworldly quality to it, as if it didn't belong here at all. He followed it for a few moments, his steps slow and deliberate. The light seemed to be guiding him, almost pulling him deeper into the woods. And then, without warning, it disappeared. Liam froze. The forest around him was dark, and still again, the strange glow vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He glanced around, feeling the weight of the silence press in on him. There was no sound, no sign of movement, just the feeling that something was watching him. He shook his head, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "Get a grip, Liam," he muttered. "It's just a trick of the light." But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. Just as he was about to turn back and leave, he heard a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from the trees themselves. "Help me." Liam froze, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see anyone, but the voice was clear, as if someone, or something, was speaking directly to him. The words sent a shiver down his spine. "Help me," the voice repeated, a little louder this time. Liam didn't think. He just moved. He ran in the direction of the voice, his flashlight flickering as he pushed through the underbrush. But the further he went, the more the voice seemed to fade, as if it was leading him further into the heart of the forest. After what felt like an eternity, Liam stumbled out of the trees, gasping for breath. He had no idea where he was anymore. The path was gone. The forest, once familiar, now seemed alien and strange. But just as he thought he might be lost for good, he heard it again, the voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, echoing through the trees like a cry for help. Liam had no choice but to follow. But this time, he wasn't sure if he was following the voice, or if the voice was leading him somewhere darker than he could imagine. Liam's heart raced as he followed the voice through the forest. Each step felt heavier, like the woods were pulling him deeper into their grasp. The voice was faint, but clear enough to guide him forward. It wasn't just any voice. It sounded desperate, as though someone or something was in pain, calling out for help. His flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows that danced along the trees. The air around him seemed colder, and the usual sounds of the forest were missing. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that hung thick in the air. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Liam stopped for a moment to catch his breath. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of trick? Was he imagining things? The students had spoken about voices and figures in the woods, but hearing it himself made the whole situation feel real in a way he couldn't ignore. "Help me." The voice came again, louder this time. It wasn't in his head. It was real. Liam hesitated, but the sound of the voice urged him forward. He pushed through the thick underbrush, his movements quick and urgent. He couldn't stop now, not after hearing it so clearly. He had to find out where it was coming from. As he moved deeper into the forest, The trees began to grow closer together, their branches twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. The familiar path had disappeared, and Liam realized he was no longer sure of where he was. The forest was darker now, the air colder, and the voice seemed to be coming from everywhere, as though it surrounded him. The voice cried out again, and this time, Liam could hear a different tone. Panic, fear. It was as if the voice was calling out to him directly, begging for help. Liam's thoughts raced. Was this part of the mystery the missing class had gone through? Was he experiencing what they had described, being trapped in a world that didn't make sense, hearing things that couldn't be real? The students had talked about a strange presence, something that watched them, something that followed them. Was this the same force, the same feeling that had taken them all those years ago? He pushed forward, the light from his flashlight barely illuminating the dark, twisted trees around him. It felt like the woods were shifting, like the trees were moving closer, narrowing his path. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the voice continued to call to him. Please, help me. Liam stumbled through the thick brush, his legs beginning to tire, his mind clouded with confusion. He had to find the source of the voice, but no matter how far he walked, it felt like he was going in circles. The trees, the ground, even the air, everything felt wrong. There was no sign of the path, no direction to follow. It was as if he had walked into another world. And then, suddenly, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest, once alive with strange sounds, was now completely still. No wind, no birds, no whispers, just an eerie quiet. Liam stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He turned around to retrace his steps, but as he did, he realized something shocking. He couldn't find the way back. The trees around him had changed. They no longer looked like the familiar forest he had entered. The landscape had shifted, and he had no idea where he was. The panic started to rise in his chest. How had this happened? He had been following a clear path, but now the forest seemed endless, twisting in on itself, trapping him in a place that didn't feel real. The voice was gone, but the feeling that something was watching him, was more real than ever. Liam stood motionless, his eyes darting through the twisted trees. The forest had changed around him, becoming something darker, something unfamiliar. It felt like it was closing in, like the trees were pressing against him, blocking his way out. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, and the silence around him felt suffocating. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Think, Liam. Think. He whispered to himself. He had been in the forest before. He knew these woods, but now everything felt wrong. The path was gone. The trees had shifted. Even the air felt different. His flashlight flickered once more, and he quickly tapped it, hoping it would stay on. The weak light showed only shadows, thick and deep, making it impossible to see far ahead. The ground was uneven underfoot, and every step felt uncertain. He had to find a way out. But then, a rustling sound broke through the silence. Liam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The rustling came again, louder this time, closer. He slowly turned around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. His heart raced. There in the distance, he saw something moving between the trees, a shadow, tall and shapeless. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else, something in between. "Hello," Liam called out, his voice shaky. "Who's there?" The shadow didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, watching him. The feeling that something was wrong washed over him, deep in his gut. This was the same presence the students had described, the same thing they had felt, the thing that had followed them all those years ago. Liam's mind raced. Was this the force that had taken the class? Was it responsible for their strange disappearance? Was this the reason they hadn't aged? Had they been stuck in some kind of twisted world? The questions kept building, but there were no answers. Only the overwhelming presence of that shadow. The rustling came again, and this time, Liam couldn't stay still. He started to move, slowly at first, then faster as the shadow seemed to get closer. He tried to stay calm, tried to think rationally, but panic was beginning to take hold. His legs carried him faster now, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, but it didn't matter. The forest seemed endless, and the shadow was still behind him. He glanced back once more, and the figure was there, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like a person. It moved like it was a part of the forest itself, shifting with the trees, blending into the darkness. It was both there and not there at the same time. "Leave me alone," Liam shouted, his voice cracking. But the shadow didn't respond. It just continued to follow him, never speeding up, never getting closer, but always there, lurking just beyond his reach. Liam's breath came in short gasps now. He had no idea where he was going, and the forest around him seemed to twist and turn in ways he couldn't understand. He had to escape. He had to get out of this place. There in front of him was a clearing, an area of the forest that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't like the dark, oppressive woods he had been in. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and in the center of it stood a large stone, covered in strange markings. Liam stepped forward, cautiously, his fear still gnawing at him. He had no idea why the stone was there, but it seemed important, almost like it was a marker, a point of significance in the twisted world around him. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing, before he approached the stone. As he got closer, he noticed something more unsettling. The markings on the stone seemed to glow faintly, like they were alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The air around the stone felt different, thicker, as if it was charged with energy. Liam reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered just above the stone. A sudden surge of heat coursed through his fingertips, making him pull back quickly, startled. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard the faint whispers again, the same ones the students had described. "Help me." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It felt real, as if it was coming from inside his own head. Liam's eyes widened as he realized the voice was coming from the stone. He stepped back, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the whispers grew louder, more desperate. Then, without warning, the shadow from the trees moved into the clearing. It wasn't just following him anymore. It was standing in front of him, towering and dark, its presence suffocating. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he faced it. The shadow had no form, no shape that he could recognize. It was a dark mass, a swirling thing that seemed to bend the very air around it. It wasn't just watching him now. It was waiting. Liam stood frozen, staring at the shadow before him. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The stone in front of him pulsed with an eerie light, and the figure, the dark presence that had haunted him, moved closer. It wasn't just a shadow. It felt like something alive, something ancient. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, instinctively reaching for his flashlight. But it flickered out, leaving him in total darkness. The only light came from the stone, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispers continued, growing more frantic as if urging him to act, to do something before it was too late. "Why are you here?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if the question was meant for the shadow or for himself. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its presence was answer enough. Liam realized that this wasn't just an entity. It was the force that had kept the students trapped all those years. It had followed them, twisted the forest, and now it was here with him. He glanced at the stone again. The markings on it seemed to shift as if they were alive, constantly changing. The energy in the clearing was growing stronger, pulling him toward the stone. It was like a magnetic force, one he couldn't fight. Liam knew he had to make a choice. He could keep running, but he had already seen that escape was impossible. The forest itself was changing, closing in on him. The students had never really left. They had been caught in this twisted reality, just like he was now. The whispers seemed to call to him, beckoning him closer to the stone. They promised answers, a way out. But Liam could feel that something wasn't right. The stone was not just a marker, it was a gateway. A gateway to whatever twisted place the students had been trapped in. "Help me." The voice was clearer now. It wasn't just the shadow speaking. It was the students. Their voices were calling out to him. But it wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. They had been here. They had tried to escape, but the force was too powerful. It had trapped them in this dark world, and it was now trying to trap him too. Liam's mind raced. He needed to find a way to stop this, to break the cycle. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for something, anything that could help him. His gaze landed on a small crack in the stone, barely noticeable at first. Without thinking, he rushed toward it, his hands trembling as he touched the crack. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, making him stumble back. The stone began to glow brighter, its power overwhelming. The shadow in front of him screamed. If it could scream. The high-pitched sound echoed in his ears, and the ground beneath him shook. He could feel the force of the stone pulling at him, trying to drag him into the darkness. But then, something inside him snapped. He remembered the students' stories, their fear, their struggles. He wasn't going to let this force win. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. With everything he had left, Liam pushed against the stone. The crack in the stone widened, and the whispers turned into screams. The shadow recoiled, but it wasn't enough. The stone cracked open, and the darkness started to fade. Slowly, the forest began to change, returning to its natural state. The trees, once twisted, stood straight again, and the air grew lighter. Liam fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The shadow was gone. The forest was silent. He had broken the cycle, but he knew the truth now. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a prison, and it would never truly let go of the souls it had trapped. But for now, Liam had won. The students had returned. The forest had released them, and Liam had found the courage to face the darkness, to break free from the grip that had held them all for so long.